After the advent of modern genetic testing, it became clear that every innovation has its perks, pitfalls, and in the words of Margaret Atwood, a downright ludicrous side you might never have foreseen. Nearly a decade ago, 72-year-old Washington native Alexander Collins made a decision that would forever alter his life. He mailed off a saliva sample for a just-for-fun DNA test. Being raised by devout Irish, American Catholics, he assumed the results would confirm his long-held heritage. Yet when the report arrived, Alexander was utterly stunned. He wasn't the man he always believed himself to be. This bombshell set him and his brother on an arduous years-long quest to unearth the true origins of their family. "Hello everyone," intoned Jake Buck from Wonderbot, and here's the dark side of DNA tests. After taking DNA test, man uncovers century-old family mystery. Before diving in, he urged viewers to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell for more captivating stories. For as long as he could remember, questions about his family's past had gnawed at Alexander. His mother, Margaret, had been a dedicated genealogist who maintained an old ledger filled with handwritten records of births, deaths, and familial ties. Tracing Margaret's side of the family was relatively straightforward, even before online genealogy databases emerged, since her lineage interwove Irish, Scottish, and English threads. Some ancestors had set foot on American soil as early as colonial times, and Alexander had even tracked a few back to the 1500s. Yet every new discovery about his mother's roots deepened his remorse, for his father's side was shrouded in mystery. "My father had nothing, no recorded history," Alexander once confided to journalist Leo Copeland. His own dad, Jim Collins, was born to Irish immigrants and had grown up with barely any knowledge of his ancestry. Jim's mother had died when he was but an infant, and his father, overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for him and his older siblings, had sent them off to a Catholic orphanage. For much of his life, Jim didn't even know his true birth year, erroneously believing he was a year older than he actually was. As Jim grew older, Alexander decided it was high time to explore his father's lineage and finally answer the question of where he came from. Even before launching the investigation, Alexander was aware of several details from his father's early life. He knew that life in the orphanage had been exceptionally harsh and that Jim's stunted build was likely a consequence of childhood malnutrition, a fact confirmed by a doctor later on. Alexander also recalled that Jim had left the orphanage during his teenage years, had a rebellious streak before enlisting in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and eventually married his own mother. He was aware, too, that Jim had a sister who had passed away when he was young and a brother with whom he was never close. Despite being a devout Catholic renowned, for instance, for preparing a mean corned beef on St. Patrick's Day, Jim's origins and the fate of his own parents remained an unresolved enigma. When Jim died in 1999, Alexander couldn't glean any more details than what his father had already known. In the ensuing years, however, Alexander managed to piece together a scant paper trail. Jim had been born in a modest neighborhood in the Bronx, New York. His father, Joseph, worked as a driver, and his mother, Katie, passed away at 32 when Jim was only 9 years old. Alexander even discovered the name of the orphanage where Jim was raised, St. Agnes Home, which had long since closed. Yet through contacting a few of the former nuns, he received nothing more than Jim's admission and discharge dates. Time marched on with little progress in his research until 2012, when the advent of at-home DNA kits sparked renewed hope. Ecstatic at the prospect, Alexander had recently pinpointed what he believed to be his father's ancestral village in Ireland, even contemplating a trip overseas to trace his paternal roots. Confident that a DNA test would simplify his search, he promptly joined the company's waiting list. When the kits finally arrived, he and his brother Jared collected cheek swabs and sent them off. A month later, however, the results left both brothers baffled. Less than half of their DNA was of Irish, Scottish, and English descent, while the remainder was an unexpected cocktail of European, Jewish, Eastern European, and Middle Eastern origins. Alexander couldn't fathom the discrepancy. Both his parents hailed from the British Isles. Surely a laboratory mix-up or a sample swap must have occurred. He wrote to the testing firm outlining what he believed was an error, then repeated the test. When the identical results returned, it became incontrovertible. The report was accurate. A barrage of questions flooded his mind. Who were his true parents? Could his mother have had an extramarital affair? Determined to uncover any concealed family secrets, Alexander realized that if his parents weren't who they claimed to be, then he wasn't who he always assumed he was. The DNA results were merely the starting point. They revealed the what but left the why shrouded in mystery. While many might have been daunted by the prospect of exhaustive research and data analysis, Alexander was far from intimidated. Having spent most of his career as an IT manager at the University of California, he was no stranger to complex data processing. "I've spent my life unraveling patterns in chaos and seeking answers to life's big questions," he explained in 2017. After overcoming his initial shock, he plunged headlong into the investigation. Perhaps his mother had been unfaithful, or maybe his grandmother had a secret lover, but such scenarios seemed improbable, for infidelity was utterly out of character for Margaret, and every one of his siblings had inherited Jim's eyes. Still, a persistent thought lingered. "My father, a man who served around the world in the army, always left me wondering." He confided this uncertainty to Leo Copeland. Alexander and Jared increasingly suspected that the key to the mystery lay on his father's side, especially given that Jim had been adopted. Were his paternal grandparents secretly Jewish? Perhaps they were Eastern European Jews who, upon immigrating to America, claimed an Irish identity for safety. To explore this possibility, Alexander arranged for two cousins, one from each side of the family, to take a DNA test. The results from his maternal cousin were entirely ordinary. They shared 12.5% of their DNA, confirming a first-cousin connection. But the findings from his paternal cousin were startling. The test revealed that Alexander and the cousin, whose mother was supposedly Jim's sister, shared no genetic markers at all. In plain terms, they were strangers on a biological level, which meant that Jim's presumed sister wasn't actually his sibling. Deeply frustrated by this revelation, Alexander was not only forced back to square one but also gripped by the fear of being ostracized by his father's side of the family due to the lack of biological ties. Confronted by the data, both he and Jared reached the staggering conclusion that their father, Jim, was not related to the couple he had been believed to be born of. "I completely lost my sense of identity," Alexander admitted in 2017. "I felt utterly adrift, no longer knowing who I truly was." For Jared, the test results confirmed a suspicion that had haunted him for years. On a trip to Ireland in the 90s, Jared had observed that no one resembled his 5'4", dark-haired father, a notion that had simmered in his mind until the DNA data turned his hunch into undeniable fact. With both their father and grandparents long dead, the brothers resolved that the only way forward was to speak with the living relatives. Did Jim have any biological siblings? Did those siblings have children? Could there be long-lost first cousins out there? By 2013, the Collins brothers had edged closer to cracking their father's mystery. They managed to obtain Jim's birth certificate and discovered that he had been sent to an orphanage by the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Alexander even wondered if his father had been mistaken for another baby when he was taken from his home, or if the orphanage had inadvertently swapped him with another infant. Acting on this intuition, he sent photographs of his father as a baby, candid images of him perched on his grandfather's lap, along with photos of Jim as an adult to a forensic artist. Hoping to determine whether the individuals depicted were indeed the same, he soon learned that there had been no mix-up at the orphanage after all. Undeterred, Alexander shifted his focus to another theory. Perhaps his father had been switched at the hospital. He embarked on a painstaking review of the birth records from the hospital where his father had been born in 1913. The task was monumental. The Bronx birth register from 1913 spanned 159 pages and was neither ordered chronologically nor did it distinguish between home and hospital births. After exhaustive scrutiny, Alexander managed to whittle the list down to 30 babies born around the same time as his father, selecting only those whose names sounded either Jewish or ethnically neutral. His hope was that one of these 30 babies would have living relatives whose DNA matched his own. Yet, even after reviewing each name, nothing definitive emerged. Not one to give up, he then combed through over 6,000 profiles marked as potential biological kin in the testing company's online database. After 2.5 years of fruitless searching, Alexander began to lose hope. His only recourse was to wait for a breakthrough. Then, on January 18, 2015, everything changed. On a quiet Sunday morning, feeling especially downcast, Alexander decided to email a distant cousin, one with whom he wasn't biologically linked, to update him on his stalled search. In a spontaneous moment, he logged into his cousin's genealogy account to peruse his list of DNA matches, a task he seldom undertook since new relatives rarely appeared. But on that fateful day, a new profile caught his attention. A stranger had submitted a DNA sample, and her results indicated a close familial connection with his cousin. Intrigued, Alexander reached out to the stranger to ask if the results were in line with what she had expected. I anticipated being far more Ashkenazi than I am, the stranger explained. Her name was Jessie Benson, and she had taken the test on a whim to learn about her Jewish roots. Instead, she discovered that she was predominantly of Irish descent, a revelation that startled her. Chilled by the coincidence, Alexander replied that his own grandmother had been born at Fordham Hospital on September 23, 1913, and asked if anyone in her family had been born around that time. Jessie responded promptly, confirming that her grandfather, Philip Benson, was indeed born around then. Overwhelmed by emotion, Alexander broke down in tears. He sensed that he was on the verge of understanding the mystery, but first, he needed proof. He delved into New York City's birth records for 1913. Initially, there was no trace of a Benson born on that day in the Bronx. Yet, after hours of searching, he finally unearthed what he'd been looking for: a Philip Benson, born on the very same day and in the same hospital as his father Jim. This, he realized with a shudder, had to be Philip Benson. Deep in his bones, Alexander understood what had transpired. There was no hidden family scandal cloaked in shame. Rather, an error at Fordham Hospital had occurred, a mistake that could only be exposed by modern DNA technology. Somehow, a Jewish baby had been mistakenly sent to an Irish family, while an Irish baby had been given to a Jewish household. The revelation stunned both families. When they compared the birth certificates, they found that Jim and Philip had been processed one right after the other, both documents signed by the same doctor. Driven by a need to understand how such a blunder could happen, Alexander researched the historical methods hospitals used to track newborns, and what he found was shocking. Back in 1913, hospitals lacked any systematic way of identifying babies. Newborns were often placed together in a common cart, making accidental switches alarmingly easy. At that time, hospital births were rare, and most facilities had yet to adopt any reliable identification system. Some institutions kept newborns in cribs adjacent to their mothers' beds, while others used centralized nurseries. Although the precise practices at Fordham Hospital remain unknown, since it closed in 1976, it is likely that they relied on the latter method. It wasn't until the late 1930s that hospitals began issuing identification bracelets to mothers and their infants. In 1913, nurses typically depended on their memory or the mother's recognition to identify newborns. Once the truth was laid bare, the Benson and Collins families exchanged photographs that clarified everything. Jim Collins bore a striking resemblance to Philip's father, a 5'4" man, and to Philip's mother, who was 4'9", while the 6-foot-tall Philip appeared to bridge the gap between his forebears, as recounted by Philip's daughter, Jason Benson. The Collins siblings, too, had long assumed that their father's shorter stature, compared to his supposed siblings, was the result of malnutrition during his orphanage days, just as the doctor had once explained. Never in his wildest dreams had Alexander imagined that his father wasn't biologically connected to the family he'd always known, a mystery that only the precision of DNA testing could unravel. In time, Alexander discovered that he had a biological first cousin, Philippa Pullman, the daughter of a sister Jim had never known existed. In 2015, Alexander journeyed to Florida to meet her. Seated on opposite ends of a couch, the two looked strikingly like siblings. Their shared DNA confirmed an undeniable bond. Philippa recalled a story about how, when her tall uncle Philip was courting his first wife, her devout Jewish parents had refused to believe he was actually Jewish until he produced his birth certificate, a document that, as it turned out, wasn't even truly his. Although the two families have maintained contact over the years, neither can shake the lingering what-if questions that haunt them. On one hand, they are overjoyed to have found each other. On the other, the revelations bring an indescribable sense of loss. How can Alexander and Philippa reconcile the fact that their fathers were not who they had always believed? And what of the lingering questions regarding identity and religion? Was Jim Collins inherently Jewish by birth, or merely Irish by upbringing? And what does that mean for Alexander's own sense of self? Both Alexander and Jared agreed that if their father had been alive, it would have been only right to reveal the truth to him. Yet, they also considered it a blessing that Jim never lived in the era of at-home DNA testing. "My dad would have lost his sense of identity," Alexander lamented, grateful that he had been spared that fate. The brothers often wondered how different things might have been if their father had been reunited with his biological family. As the Benson and Collins families exchanged photographs, Alexander felt a pang of envy. Jim was never meant to grow up in an orphanage, he mused. What kind of life would he have led if raised by the Benson family, his true kin? Perhaps, Alexander speculated, Jim would have had a stable home, graduated from high school, and surely put his natural talent for mathematics to good use. Instead, Jim had dropped out of high school, served in the army, and later worked as a prison guard in California. In the end, while he managed to forge a decent life for himself, Alexander and his family could not help but mourn the childhood lost to the orphanage's harsh realities. As a child in the orphanage, my father only got an orange for Christmas, Alexander recalled wistfully. Had the hospital switch not occurred in 1913, neither Alexander nor his siblings would have come into existence. The Collins children owe their very lives to a seemingly trivial error, a nurse's fleeting lapse of attention, that set off a chain of events with far-reaching consequences. It was a grievous mistake, yet how can one harbor resentment for an error that in its own way allowed Alexander Collins's story to be told? The Collins family's very existence is a testament to an administrative oversight, a momentary lapse that reshaped history.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.